And now we come to our last video for the nervous tissue, neuronal circuits, and we'll also explore regeneration and repair. So, you have within the brain billions of neurons. They're all intricately connected, and this really tightly knit network of neurons gives you all of the important activities that control the autonomic nervous system, that give you the ability for thought control, and even have what we call some emergent properties, like the concept of emotions or ethical reasoning and things like that. But we're going to just break it down into some simple neuronal circuits today. So these are circuits that are pre-existing and pre-wired. They're not really, they don't have anything to do really with long-term memory, but many of them are involved in short-term memory. And they're very important for everyday activities like reflex activities like breathing, or short-term memory, or the ability to wake up. Now these different neuronal circuits take on some very characteristic patterns. Here we see an example of two of the neuronal circuits, the diverging circuit and a converging circuit. And these names make perfect sense. In a diverging circuit, you start off with a small number of neurons that govern a much larger number of neurons elsewhere in the body. So you have one neuron maybe will branch and synapse with two neurons. Those neurons will branch and synapse with other neurons. So you may have just a small area of the brain that controls all of the motor neurons that would impact one muscle. Of course, when you use a muscle, there's lots of different somatic motor neurons that are responsible for moving that muscle. So this would be a good example of divergence within the nervous system. Then we see a converging circuit. In a converging circuit, you have lots of input that goes to a single output neuron. So a single motor neuron synapses with lots of skeletal muscle fibers at that neuromuscular junction. They could receive input from different brain areas. So those would be a converging circuit. Next we have a reverberating circuit. In a reverberating circuit, impulses are sent back through the circuit over and over again. So these are often involved with reflex activities that have to occur over and over and over again, like breathing. You don't have just one reflexive breath, you have multiple breathing reflexes that are coordinated over and over again. Another good example of this might be short-term memory. So if you've ever tried to remember one last bit of information and you repeat that bit of information over and over and over again, what you're doing is essentially mimicking one of these reverberating circuits. Then finally, parallel after discharge circuit. So you have a small number of presynaptic cells that distribute responsibility among several different pathways within, for example, the brain. And then those eventually will converge back together. So you will distribute the information, and then the processing will occur parallel to each other, and then it converges back together. So a good example of this is with things like mathematical calculations. A great example would be a word problem with math. So you are told that, I don't know, a train leaves the Pennsylvania station at 4 in the afternoon, and another train will leave the New York station at 6 in the evening, and they're running towards each other. One is traveling at 70 miles per hour, one is traveling at 85 miles an hour. You're given the length of the track and you're asked when are they going to impact each other. So there's a lot of different things you have to do. You read that bit of information. One part of your brain is devoted to understanding literally the words that are on the sheet of paper. Another area of your brain is responsible for having learned in the past the mathematical calculations that are necessary for that. And Another area of your brain may have to deal with the emotional trauma of there being a huge train wreck at some point. I don't know. But you have different areas within the brain that deal with different aspects of the problem, and then they come back together for one final output. Regeneration repair. So remember, regeneration is not so good, but the brain is amazingly plastic. So plasticity refers to the ability to change the shape of the neurons throughout your life. So neurons are very plastic. You can sprout new dendrites. You can begin to synthesize new types of proteins or new neurotransmitters. You can alter their connections with other neurons. So they're very plastic throughout their life, but they have very limited abilities to repair. Now, we've gone over this in class a little bit when we were going through the importance of the Schwann cells. So the peripheral nervous system, the PNS, does have some ability to repair some damaged dendrites and mainly the axons, the structures that are enclosed within the Schwann cells. But in the central nervous system, you're essentially out of luck. Once you damage that neuron, it will most likely die. So let's look at repair within the peripheral nervous system, especially those that have the Schwann cells associated with them. So if the neural cell body is intact, the portion of the neuron that has the nucleus, then the Schwann cells will become active. They can form a regeneration tube. This also depends on scar tissue not forming too rapidly. If scar tissue forms very rapidly, it's essentially going to damage and get in the way of that regeneration tube. So let's look at what happens when you do begin this repair process within the peripheral nervous system. So up at the top, A is a normal neuron. You can see the cell body that would be usually contained within the central nervous system. And then we have the axon with the Schwann cells wrapping around different areas, leaving the little nodes of Ranvier between each of the Schwann cells. And let's say you had damage to this neuron. So that's what we see in B is damage. One of the first things that's going to happen is all of the Nissl bodies, and the Nissl bodies are organelles in the neural cell body that are responsible for creation of proteins. So they are forms of rough endoplasmic reticulum. They will break up into these fine little masses, mainly indicating that they are producing lots of proteins. So it's going to need a lot of proteins to regenerate, and that's known as chromatolysis. The next step is Wallerian degeneration, and that's breakdown of the axon and the myelin sheath distal to the injury, and in fact retrograde back one node. So let me flip back and we can see Wallerian degeneration. So here in B we can see Wallerian degeneration. So that means the axon past this point right here, whoops, the axon past that area begins to degenerate, and in fact it'll go all the way back one node to a nice fresh healthy node of Ranvier is why it's going back one node. So that's called Wallerian degeneration. And then the next thing that happens will be the formation of that regeneration tube and regeneration within the regeneration tube. And remember, the regeneration tube is made up of the Schwann cells. So they rapidly go through mitosis and they form a little repair tube. Then the axon will bud and it will begin to regrow down the tube, although it takes a while. It only will grow maybe 1.5 millimeters per day. So obviously the shorter the area that's been damaged, the more likely it is you're going to have successful repair within the peripheral nervous system. If you have to regenerate a very long area in the peripheral nervous system, you have a higher risk of it not reconnecting. Now, neurogenesis, the creation of new neurons. If you remember back a few days ago in class, we did a think, pair, share about the tumor development within the central nervous system. And I said that, well, neurons don't go through mitosis, they don't grow, so that's not going to be the source of the neural tumor. Well, there is some evidence that there could be some new neurons that do occur in humans. To do this, you've got to have some stem cells that are active. Now, there are some areas where it's believed there might be some neurogenesis. It's mainly in an area of the brain. I'll give you the name. It's called the hippocampus. Hippocampus. Let me write it out for you. An area of the brain called the hippocampus. And this is the center of learning and memory. And it's been shown that sometimes new neurons will develop in that area, but it is very rare. Okay, new neurons could grow in that area because there are a lot of growth factors in that area, which you normally don't find in any other area of the central nervous system. So most other areas of the brain and the spinal cord will have a lack of neurogenesis. In fact, there are active factors that prevent neurogenesis. Neuroglial cells actually produce chemicals to inhibit the growth of stem cells within the central nervous system. There aren't very many growth stimulating factors. There's no neurolemmas in the central nervous system. Remember, there are neurolemmas in the peripheral nervous system. Those are formed by the Schwann cells. So usually in the central nervous system, you just get some rapid scar tissue if you have actual damage to the tissue in the central nervous system. Now, this is actually good. I mean, it sounds strange to say that it's good that the central nervous system won't regrow new neurons. But the problem is the central nervous system is in charge of controlling the body. And to do that, it has to maintain perfect balance between growth and breaking something apart. Between an agonist and an antagonist. It has to maintain homeostasis. You can't let something get too fast or get too slow. You want to keep it within the correct levels. So if you suddenly began to grow new neurons in an area, then one aspect of that homeostasis might get out of whack. You might lose some controllability because activity levels go way up because of all the new neurons. So it's actually a protective factor that prevents neurogenesis within the central nervous system. And that's going to do it for our video lecture series for the nervous system. Remember, hopefully you will have looked through these video lectures in order, and we will be picking up again with the spinal cord on the week after Thanksgiving. Have a good break.